So in the previous slide or else in the previous video, I just talked about Indian writing in English, but this time I am going to present you some background materials or else some of the references made by Edgar Allan Poe for his poem The Raven. So this video is based on American literature. Let us move on to the video. So the poem is Raven. Something about the poem. This poem is a narrative poem. So I hope you all know what is meant by narration. It's merely telling a story in a form verse. The poet Edgar Allan Poe tries to tell a story. So the poem is narrative poem. It was written in 1845 and it is noted for its musicality. That is, for its rhythmic tone and rhyming scheme. This poem is noted very much, and the language is very much stylish, and it shows the poetic skill of the poet Poe. And one more thing to be applauded in the poem is its supernatural atmosphere. Nobody can imagine such an atmosphere in which the poet himself experienced the same, and he just narrated what he has experienced through the poem. So the atmosphere is highly supernatural and it adds value to the narration. So the tone as well as the theme selected by the poet is once again the sadness, because the tone sadness gives pleasure to all the human beings. And which sadness will give all the pleasure? The loss of somebody else, the loss of somebody who was loved very much by one. That will give pleasure to us. So that was taken by Poe in the poem Raven to experience the pleasure as well as to pass on that pleasure to the readers. He has chosen once again sadness tone in the poem Raven. So a distraught lover is paid a mysterious visit by a talking raven. This is the gist of the narration of the poem. So a lover was there and the lover was already in a pain, or else he was experiencing a pain because of the loss of his lady love, and that lover was visited by a talking raven. That itself is unimaginable because raven can't talk. Only the parrots can talk. But here the poet chose the bird raven who is going to talk. So the talking raven, whether it increases the pain of the poet or else it just gives soothness to the poet. That is a question mark. So that's what in the poem. So let's move on to the next one, how the poem goes on. The lover is lamenting the loss of his love, Lenore. The name of his lady love is Lenore. Only because of the rhyming scheme, to add the musicality or else the musical essence of the poem, the poet has given the loss of his lady love in the name of Lenore. And in the poem he explained that the name Lenore was given by the angels, because that lady love looks like an angel. So one more thing, so how the poet began, or else the poem began by the poet. The poet Poe himself was sitting in his study room, and at that time raven visited him, and without any respect, because it's simply a bird, but it never showed any respect to the poet. Without showing any respect, it simply sat on the bust of Pallas in the chamber door of the poet. And it antagonizes the protagonist. So who is the protagonist? Of course, the poet is the protagonist. So that protagonist was antagonized by this bird with the refrain. That is very much important in the poem, and that shows the musical quality as well as the aesthetic quality of the poet Poe. The refrain used there is nevermore. So the name of the lover is Lenore. The refrain used by the poet is nevermore. Both are rhyming together. Lenore, nevermore. Nevermore, nevermore, nevermore. The word is repeated all through the poem, and that refrain added richness to the poem. And more than that, there are so many folk, mythological, religious and classical references in this poem. Let's see one by one. And one more thing, it was published in the year 1845. In the very next year, 1846, Poe himself has published the essay, The Philosophy of Composition, in which he explained why he has chosen the poem, why he has chosen the bird, why he has chosen the particular theme, why he has chosen the particular tone. All these things were explained in clear way in that follow-up essay. So what is the background of the poem, or else how Poe was inspired by the bird raven? Already a talking raven was introduced by Charles Dickens in his novel Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of 80. Once again, the rhythm and the meter in the poem Raven was inspired through the Elizabeth Barrett's poem Lady Geraldine's Courtship. So, from these two influences, Poe has taken the rhythm as well as the talking raven as a symbol for his poem. So, something about the poet Edgar Allan Poe. He is a well-known American writer, poet, author, editor, literary critic, and he has written so many poems and short stories. And his short stories are full of mystery. And his short stories are called Tales of Mystery and Macabre. And he is the central figure of Romanticism because he is a sensuous poet. And in this poem, Raven, he was very much sensuous to the ear. How he has used the words related to sound. How he has used the words related to the sound made by the bird, the sound made by the poet, the sound made by the curtains, sound made by the embers. All these things are repeated in the poem to create sensuousness, which is the essential characteristic feature of Romanticism. So, he is also a central figure in Gothic fiction, and that's why in this poem also some kind of mysteriousness was used as a background. And he is the inventor of detective fiction, contributed to the genre of science fiction, but he has earned his living through only writing, and so his life was full of pathetic events, and that pessimism was completely shown in his poem. So now come to Raven, and there are three themes in the poem Raven. The first one is undying devotion. The undying devotion of the poet Poe is clearly expressed in the poem because all the time he was remembered of the thoughts of his Lenore. So that was undying devotion to his lady love. That was expressed in the poem. That is the first theme. And the second theme, the conflict between desire to forget and desire to remember. He desires to forget Lenore. At the same time, he desires to remember Lenore forever. So there was a conflict in his mind, and it was painful for his heart. But still, he enjoyed that pain because it gave pleasure to him. That is the second theme of the poem. And the third theme is pleasure from focusing on loss of his lady love. So since he lost his lady love, he was full of sadness, and that sadness gives him pleasure. So not the loss, but the pleasure occurred from the loss is the theme. So there are three themes in the poem, and the next important thing in the poem is refrain. The refrain is the constantly or as continuously used word nevermore. And this nevermore was used as an answer given by the bird raven for all the questions asked by the poet Poe. But still, we are sure about one thing, even the parrot can repeat what we are all saying, but the raven can't. So the bird raven is unclear what it is said, but still that word nevermore gives meaning to all the questions asked by the poet. What are all the questions asked by the poet? Let's see one by one. So there was a development in the poem because at first Poe was completely weak and weary out of the loss. But progressively, after the visit of the bird, what happens to his mind? What happens to his soul? His weak soul becomes stronger and he is regretful, but at last he was smiling with the arrival of the bird raven. But finally he has gone mad because for all the questions asked by the poet, the raven gives only one answer, nevermore, nevermore, nevermore. So finally he became mad out of the bird. So what is the form of the poem? The form of the poem is simply elegy because it is mourning on the death of his lady love. But we can't call simply as an elegy, but there is one more form, Elegia Paraclasithron. That is, it is an ancient Greek and Roman poetic form which is lamenting excluded, locked out lover at the sealed door. That is, inside the four walls. The lover is lamenting for the loss of his lady love. That is the form of the poem. And the time and rhyming scheme of the poem. The time is December. So December is the month which is associated with darkness. So Poe has chosen the theme sadness and he has chosen the time darkness. And the bird raven symbolizes mournful and never-ending remembrance. So he has not chosen the happy bird, but instead of that he has chosen the mournful bird. And the rhythm is trochai. So trochai, I hope you can understand. Trochai means the stressed syllable followed by unstressed syllable. So that was followed by Poe all through the poem, and the rhyming scheme is A, B, C, D, D, D. So a passage contains 6 lines. The first 3 lines has different sounds A, B, C. The next 3 lines end with the same sound D, D, D. And what are the mythological reference Poe has got for this poem Raven? The first one is Norse mythology, in which the character Odin possessed 2 ravens, Hugin and Munin, and in Hebrew folklore, Noah sends a white raven to see what happened in the ark, but the raven did not return immediately. So out of anger, Noah turned the white raven into black raven. And one more reference is Ovid's Metamorphosis, and in that also raven begins as white. But at last Apollo only turned white raven into black raven. So these 3 are the mythological references we can get before the poem Raven. So from these references, Poe may get some kind of thinking about using the bird raven. And coming to the poem. So Poe was sitting in his study room and he was about to nap, and it is midnight December. And what are all the sounds used by the poet? He heard tapping sound and rapping sound made by the visitor. And afterwards, the poet Poe himself muttered, "Who are you? Who is the visitor?" And he muttered. So look at the word used by Poe, muttered. He is not talking, instead of that he muttered. And there is a rustle of purple curtain. For curtain also Poe has used the color purple. Once again the color image which reveals darkness. And whisper, murmur. And he heard the whispering and murmuring sound of Lenore. Lenore. So there also the sound is not very much clear, but instead of that whisper, murmur, and once again progressively the tapping sound of the visitor becomes louder. So passage after passage the sound made by the poet becomes louder. And there are two things, that is binary things. Poe himself got confused whether the visitor is madam or sir, male or female. But at last he concluded that visitor is male because Lenore is female, so the visitor is male. And what are all the movements used by the poet? Ember wrought. That is the only one action we can see in that midnight. Ember wrought. And by that we can get the sound. And the poet nod the head. That is the only action made by the poet. And flung the shutter. Shutter of the window was flung by the poet to see who is the visitor. And at last he can see the flutter of the bird. Just the bird flutter. So what are the emotions he just quoted? At first he was weary and weak, and progressively he became strong. And he was wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming. All these are emotions experienced by the poet on the arrival of the bird. And at last his fancy becomes a smile after the arrival of the bird, because the bird becomes very much close with the poet. So the death and darkness are oft-repeated themes of Poe's all literary works, and in this poem also, again and again, passage after passage, he just repeated the death and darkness. Because at first he imagined that there was no visitor except darkness. And afterwards, Raven entered his chamber and he just perched on the bust of Pallas. Once again, it refers to death. And next, the poet asked the question, where are you coming from? Are you from night's Plutonian shore? Once again, it refers to death. So these are the questions asked by the poet. What is your name? Tell me your name. For that question, the answer given by the bird is nevermore. And the next question, will you leave me tomorrow? That is the next question asked by the poet. For that question also, the answer is nevermore. And the third question asked by the poet is whether I can forget my Lenore. With all the pain he is asking that question, and the bird answered, nevermore. Okay, if I can't forget my Lenore, will you be the balm? Will you give me soothness? That was the next question asked by the poet. For that question also the bird replied, nevermore. And at last, the poet again asked the same question. Will you take your beak out of my heart because I can't bear the pain? For that question also, the bird answered, nevermore. So for all the questions asked by the poet, the only answer given by the bird is nevermore. So at last, Poe could not conclude whether this is a bird or beast, whether this is a bird or devil, whether this is a bird or fiend. And there are so many adjectives used for the bird: grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird. So the bird was completely praised by the poet, and side by side his emotions are overbrimming in his heart. But he can't forget his Lenore. He can't forget his Lenore. He can't remember his Lenore forever. Both the desires are conflicting in his heart. So with that conflict, he just embraced the soul of, or the shadow of, the bird Raven. So with that, the poem ends. And we also can feel the same pain the same pleasure experienced by the poet. So at last, we also can repeat the same word, mutter the same word, nevermore. Thank you.